Hello, everyone. Welcome to Both Sides of the Bars. My name is Ronald Day. I'm a Senior Vice President here at the Fortune Society. Excited to have a conversation today with two of our colleagues on a very important topic. So, today we have Barbara Allan and also Dr. Avon Hart-Johnson. The title for today's show is Supporting the Children of Incarcerated People, a National Parents' Day special. So I'm going to do a quick synopsis. The arrest of a parent can be traumatic for many children. The removal of a mother or father from a child's life forces the child to confront emotional, social, and economic consequences that may trigger behavioral problems, poor outcomes in school, and a disruption or a severance of the relationship while the incarcerated parent with the incarcerated parent that may persist even after the parent is released from prison. So today's conversation is about supporting the children of incarcerated people. So our guest, Barbara Allan, I'd like to introduce you and allow you to just give a brief introduction about yourself and the work that you do, and also Dr. Avon Hart-Johnson. So Barbara, why don't you tell our audience a little bit about yourself and the work that you do, and then we'll invite Dr. Hart-Johnson to do the same.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Ron. Um, I got uh, forced into this work when my husband became incarcerated. In 1966, my husband shot and killed his father in my kitchen. And I was devastated. I had two young children. They were about 2 and 3 years old at the time. And I had never, ever known anyone who had ever been near a prison. My only the only thing I knew about a prison was I went to Rikers Island as a student taking sociology, and even then I said, "Oh my God!" And this was back in 1956. They lock people up in cages. But then I walked away from Rikers and I kind of forgot about it until the day I got the phone call from my husband saying, "Barbara, I just shot and killed my father." And that led me into a journey that here I am over 55 years later, still trying to help families never to have to go through this journey by themselves. My first contact really, Ron, was with the Fortune Society. Way back in 1967, I wrote a letter to the Fortune Society. And after seeing a television show they did, their first television show with David Susskind, and I wrote to the Fortune Society, David Rutherford, not knowing who he was at the time, and told him I was doing my time on the outside. And I became a part of the Fortune Society, and with the support I got from them, I was able to help other people.
Excellent. That's such a profound story. And Fortune, we talk a lot about how we get involved in service delivery by the experiences of the individuals that we serve and family members. So thank you for sharing that story with us. Very powerful. Now I want to turn it over to you, Dr. Hart Johnson, to give an introduction of yourself and the work that you do, and then we'll get into the conversation.
Sure. Thank you. I am the vice president for the International Coalition for Children of Incarcerated Parents. And a lot of the work that we do is to raise the level of awareness about the adversities and the impacts that incarceration can have on the family, particularly the children. And our goal is to disseminate research, put that research out there in the form of a book, in journal articles, and research data so that others might use it. But the other thing that we do is try to raise awareness in communities, and we do that through advocacy. So I belong to a number of advocacy groups, including one that was spawned out of my own organization, DC Project Connect. And our goal is not just to raise awareness through information sharing, but kind of roll up our sleeves and do the work. That means that you might find us in schools trying to inform teachers on how better to interact with children. You might find us before legislators trying to advocate for policy change that benefits children of incarcerated parents so that their lives are not silenced while they still experience the stigma. So a lot of the work can be categorized to three categories, I believe: authorship, advocacy, and research.
Thank you so much for that. So I want to get started by asking you, Barbara, a question, because here we're talking about the children and we're also going to be talking about the parents, right? And so, Barbara, you work a lot with children who have incarcerated parents because you said to David, like, you're out here on the outside to a certain extent, right? Because your husband was incarcerated. But insofar as the children is concerned, like, what do you tell the children? How much detail is necessary to give children who have an incarcerated parent? Because you know the story. Sometimes I'm in college. I'm away in the military. You know, sometimes we are very skeptical about sharing with our children that the parent is actually incarcerated.
You have to be honest with your children. Depending upon their age, you present it to them in a way that they can understand. With my own two children, I told them that their daddy had done something that he should not have done and that he was in the adult timeout. And I gradually introduced them to the facts as they were old enough to understand them. I never, ever lied to my children. You know, when we were having support group meetings, we had what we called a couples group, where the couples who are on the way out, the reentry people, were coming together and sharing. And and we talked about this, but one of the couples related to me years later that they had told their children, they had two children, that daddy was away in school. Years later, they went upstate just on a trip after daddy came home, and one of the children said, "Oh, look, this is where daddy was in prison." Neither of the parents realized that they didn't fool their children. Their children knew. So I think it's so important that we are as honest as the children are able to accept it.
Thank you for that, Barbara. I mean, the old saying goes, honesty is the best policy. You know, sometimes we want to protect our children, but when the children find out, they might actually turn against us for lying to them or being deceptive, even though we thought we were doing something for them. So I'm gonna come back to you. No, go ahead, go.
No, every child has to have a parent they can trust. The parent who's incarcerated, we have no idea what the relationship was and what it will continue to be. But the parent who is raising the child has to be the person that this child can trust.
Thank you for that. Now, Dr. Hart-Johnson, what makes the children of incarcerated parents a unique population? You know, as Barbara said, she was the wife. You have grandparents. All these individuals, considering mass incarceration in the U.S., they're people who are relatives of incarcerated people. But why? What makes the children unique? What's special about them?
Well, I like it that you framed in terms of explaining the children who are impacted. 1 in 28 children are impacted, but when you start to look at BIPOC or children of color and Black children, you start to narrow that number down and it becomes like 1 of 9. And then you start to look at the data a little bit closer and you start to see that those statistics are just alarming. What makes them unique is that incarceration is considered an adverse childhood experience. So, what's an adverse childhood experience? That could be childhood neglect, it could be a significant loss like death or accident, a traumatic event occurring in the child's life. But what's interesting about incarceration is that it comes with so many of these nuances, such as the stigma and the shame, if the child is old enough to feel those experiences. The other thing is that it's an attachment loss, and I think Barbara explained it. It's like you've got to tell the children the truth. You don't have to give them the detail, but at least tell them the truth, because many children suffer from attachment loss. And what that means is that the greater the significance of the relationship or the attachment, the more significant feelings of grief and loss. And the thing about this kind of grief and loss is that it's generally without closure, because the child has the ambiguity of not knowing when their life is going to return back to normal. So, it's interesting that when we look at how a child is impacted, they could be impacted psychologically if they have stressors in their life, like conflict within the home, or unintentional neglect. And what I mean by that is, suppose the mother or the caregiver has to go out and take on extra jobs to meet that income level of someone who was in the house or in the home, and they're now incarcerated. So you've got that child not just losing one parent, but now they've lost two. The environmental stressors that may occur in the home, say for instance, they've had to move in with someone else, it may place conditions on that child where all the things that were familiar to the child is lost. The school, maybe they have to get uprooted from the school or their community. Toxic stress is unaddressed stress, where a child experiences contiguous stress. And what happens with that, and the danger, is that it weakens the immune system. So you hear that sometimes children have asthma, or they have obesity, or they later grow up to have like heart disease and things like that. It's because of these conditions of toxic stress. So yes, it is a very unique population.
Thank you for that information. Appreciate you sharing that with us. Barbara, going back to the conversation we were having with respect to talking to the children, how do you explain the father's absence? I mean, in your situation, it was a very tragic uh, scenario. You have all kind of reasons that people end up incarcerated, right?
Yes.
Here we're just how do you explain the father's absence? And now our society increasingly is incarcerating more women, so we also have a lot of women who are now incarcerated. How do you explain the absence to the child?
Again, as I said, you have to be as honest as the children can understand at their age. And you, the parent, as I said, I told my children that daddy did something he should not have done, and he is being punished. And another thing I feel is so important, children have to be allowed to express their feelings about what is happening. I cried with my children. I showed them that it's okay to cry. It's okay to feel bad. But then we get on and we go on with our lives. But we have to be open and honest. If we do not explain to our children in a way that they can understand, they're going to feel guilty. A child feels guilt if a parent dies. Like, what did I do to cause my father's death, or my mother? How could I have avoided it? As far as a child with a mother incarcerated, of course, so often it's the grandparent who has to assume the responsibility of the child. I say often that the family is the collateral damage of the criminal justice system. And we have to have the resources to go on and to live decent lives ourselves. I could proudly say that I raised two children whose father was in prison, whose father was in rehabs and etc. And they turned out to be wonderful children and wonderful adults. So it does happen. And it can happen. And that's what we should focus on. There are success stories.
Thank you for that. And Dr. Hart-Johnson, in what ways are the children of incarcerated parents misunderstood? I'm sure that there's a lot of misconception out there. There are a lot of times when children have an incarcerated parent and they might want their parent to go with them to watch the school play or go with them to some sporting event or something like that, and the parent is not available. And so children are misunderstood. Sometimes children might themselves be deceptive about their parents' incarceration. Give us, enlighten the audience a little bit about how children are misunderstood who are have
Sure,
incarcerated
sure.
parents.
Absolutely. So children are misunderstood because, children respond to their environments and how they're treated. And oftentimes, one of the biggest myths is that children of incarcerated parents are going to grow up to become incarcerated themselves. Let me clarify that that is a myth. If a child has a well regulated adult in the family that gives them love, that gives them support, that gives them that kind of uplift and motivation that Barbara gave to her children, then you're going to see a thriving child. um, Children have a tendency to behave in a way as they're responding to their environments, even in school. So sometimes children are misunderstood because they show up at school and they're restless and they're not sitting down and maybe they're jumping around. And I try to tell teachers sometimes children are acting that way because that's the only place that they can be children, because they may have adulting responsibility at home. And that may not seem like it's plausible, but in some of our research studies, we found that children were, cooking food, washing clothes, caring for their younger siblings. So children might get a chance to really be kids when they're at school, and oftentimes they're misunderstood by their teachers. The other thing is that children have a tendency to process their inner worlds through playing. So I thought Barbara was going to say earlier, and I wanted to chime in that let children be children and tell them the truth to the degree that it's age appropriate, but allow children to play because, number one, you're removing that adult responsibility, and you allow them to process their world through play. So thank you for that.
No, that's super helpful for us. And Barbara, back to you. So there's always a question, depending on, like you said, age appropriate, whether or not parents should even take children, or grandparents or whomever should take the children to visit the loved one, the parent that's incarcerated. What are your thoughts on that? Because some people are like, I don't want my child going inside of a correctional facility. I don't want my child to have that experience. And I can't begrudge a parent for saying, I don't want my child or myself to have to deal with the trauma. But we also know that there's a need at times for children to maintain the relationships that they have with that particular loved one, mother or father.
I am so glad you asked me that, because I have very strong feelings that a child has to know their parent, but an institution, a prison, has to make their facility child friendly. And I always go back to my personal story. When my husband was first arrested, um, there were no contact visits in New York State. The only place that had a contact visit was Sing Sing. And back then, Sing Sing was reception for everyone. So no matter what you crime, you were sent to Sing Sing. And I could bring my children. They could play with their father. They could see him. They were too young to read his letters. They were just squiggly lines on a page to them. Back then, there were no telephone calls. A loved one could not call you from prison. But I was so happy I could bring my children there and they could see that he's a real person. Then my husband was moved to Greenhaven, and Greenhaven did not have contact visits. They had a ceiling to table screen. I would not allow my husband or my children to visit my husband in a cage. I no longer allowed them to go for visitation. I think if the environment is a healthy environment for the children, such as we have in Bedford Hills, our women's prison in New York State, where they have a playroom for the children and games and places for the children to be able to relax. A child has to know their parent. their imagination can be worse than reality. But again, that is up to the individual parent. I can understand why someone would not want to bring their child into the environments as they exist today. But I think there has to be a lot more work done to make a prison a place where a child can feel comfortable. Does that answer your question, or did I go
It
off
answers it.
on a tangent?
No, no, no. That was perfect. And that leads me to my next question for you, Dr. Hart-Johnson, because there are stigmas associated and trauma associated with incarceration and with visiting a loved one that's incarcerated. What are three things that you think adults could do to prevent further perpetuating the harms and stigmas and the shame to children of incarcerated parents?
Well, the first thing is that parents should have a very attuned nature where they're tuned into their children, they're paying attention. And I kind of alluded to this earlier, is that you need a well regulated adult. Children's worlds are colored by the way that their parents behave, and they even learn how to problem solve and how to develop emotional regulation, how to deal with stress and things like that. The parents are the first models, the role models. And so, having a well regulated adult in the house that is consistent, that helps to uplift their character and tell them that they are loved and uplift all the strengths that they have, using a strength-based parenting approach is ideal. Never speak poorly or badly about the incarcerated parent. No matter how much you disagree with that parent, you know, try your best not to, badmouth the incarcerated parent, because that child usually has unconditional love unless something occurred between the child and the parent. And here's something that's really important: allow the child to make choices. It is very likely that their world was upended, that maybe they left their childhood home and had to go somewhere else, left their school, their favorite, friends or whatever. Let them have choices so that you return a sense of empowerment. And don't just assume that when you move and decide, okay, we're going to downsize, that you can just do it on your own. Allow the child to make choices, because you never know the significance of the attachments that they may want to bring. And so let them make choices so that they feel restored and have that sense of empowerment, and also that they can feel that they matter.
Excellent. That's super helpful. Thank you so much for that. Barbara, I wanted to follow up with you about something that you said, and that is the facilities need to create a healthy environment for the children. And you mentioned Bedford Hills. I know that some facilities are doing that. Another point about that is the engagement of the parent with the child. Because, sometimes I was inside for 15 years, and it's always about how do I interact with my child. Sometimes I'll be on visits, you see the child just running around, and the parent would be interacting with whoever the adult is, but not really with the child. What advice could you give to parents and others for what to do with the child when they're actually going to visit a loved one who's incarcerated?
To keep it as honest as possible. Talk about things that are important to the child. Talk about their school, and let the parent who's incarcerated have some connection with the child. Maybe the child well, you can't bring papers into the visiting room, but talk about a project they're doing in school, or what they're learning, and let the parent be part of that. We want to be inclusive. Uh, it's very difficult to have that kind of relationship when it's long distance. If the child is a little bit older, perhaps the child could talk about a book that they're reading to the parent, and maybe the parent who's incarcerated could actually be reading the same book, to be on the same page, to be level with the child. Of course, the parent should show, a lot of concern as to what the child's life. Be a part of it. I tell the families that I work with, the Prison Families Alliance, bring reality into the prison. You know, so many families don't want to put a burden on their incarcerated loved one. So if their child is having difficulty, they're not going to admit it. They're going to say everything is wonderful. No, it's not. And the parent should be aware of what's really going on in the child's life.
That's excellent. I love the idea of reading a book that your child is reading and engaging with them and being concerned, obviously, about what's happening with the child, not just with the parent. Um, Dr. Hart-Johnson, we only have like a minute or so left. Can you give us some information about what legislators can do to protect children of incarcerated parents in a minute or so?
Sure. The number one thing is to pass legislation so that people who interact with children of incarcerated parents are trauma informed. That's in a school resource officer, prison officials, anyone who touches base with a child and interacts with them should treat them with trauma informed sensitivity. The second thing that they can do is provide funding for nonprofits, for mentoring programs, and for community programs. And those programs need to be trauma responsive as well.
Thank you. Oh my goodness, this was a wonderful conversation. So thank you so much, Barbara Allan. Seeing you in this particular space here, communicating to our audience about this very important issue. And thank you also, Dr. Hart-Johnson, for the work that you've done over the years to support parents and children of those who are incarcerated. And thank you to our audience for joining us again for this great episode. And looking forward to talking with you again. So excited, the ideas that were presented here, being more trauma informed, making sure that we're engaging with our children. Thank you so much from this special Children of Incarcerated People, a National Parents Day special. Have a nice day.